So I have done a video on this topic before, but I want to do one again because I want to provide a lot more statistics to back up my argument. Because this is a very important topic, and this is the subject of whether the US is unequivocally the best country in the world to live in. And this is something that I see argued about constantly, especially on Twitter. But I see MAGA types very, very aggressively promoting the idea that the US is the best country in the world to live in every single metric imaginable. I don't really see people making the same claims about any other country in the world saying that like it's the best in every single way. Like people might say, for instance, European countries are the best in terms of like social safety nets and in terms of many quality of life indices, but I feel like it's only MAGA types who really will actually argue that their country is the best in literally every conceivable metric. Because most Europeans would admit, okay, yes, but Americans make more money than we do, or they have a lower unemployment rate, or what have you. Like, I don't know. In my personal experience, I just find MAGA types are the most absolutely uppity about this. Like they will not concede on any issue at all. And so I want to go through metric by metric showing why the US is not the best country in terms of quality of life in every single metric. And I'm going to say also I'm going to look at also the state by state breakdown to show that in most of these metrics red states are actually the worst, because many a time MAGA types will claim that blue states drag down the country as a whole, but in many cases that's actually not true. Now, when looking at the state by state basis, there are certain states that always, like almost always, stand out as exceptions. New Mexico tends to perform very poorly for a blue state in a lot of the metrics where red states do badly. It seems to cluster more with red states on most metrics, which makes sense because New Mexico is similar to red states in many regards. Like, it's a fairly low population density state. It's not overly urbanized. The cities it does have aren't overly dense or walkable or transit oriented. It seems like a red state in many ways, but it just happens to vote blue. And I do wonder in the future, will New Mexico become a red state simply because it, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, I don't know. We'll see what happens. Conversely, Utah is often an exception for being better than most red states on many metrics. And again, I think that has a lot to do with Mormonism, frankly, and how it creates a very strong sense of discipline. And also in New Mexico's case, like the fact that it has a very high Hispanic and Native American population are undoubtedly factors as well. But at the same time, it's not just demographics, because say for instance, like Maryland has a high black population, but it doesn't do badly on at least many of these metrics. It does badly on some, but not others. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors going on here. Now in regards to the argument that like racial demographics is the only reason why the US does badly in certain metrics, or why red states do badly in certain metrics, because they point to like the high black population in many southern states in particular. Firstly, yes, demographics are an issue, which is partly why the argument that the US is the greatest country in the world in every way are invalid. It's like, yes, blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans do contribute highly to some of these metrics where the US does not perform well. Absolutely. Yes, that is a valid issue, and it is, but it's like, yes, if you live in the US, you do have to deal with these issues. And this is a reason again why many Canadians don't want to join the US, because if you join the US, then suddenly these demographics are all your countrymen and countrywomen. In particular, Black Americans are. So, yes, I mean, they're correct in pointing out that many of these issues do correlate with these particular demographic groups. But my response is, well, yes. And it's like, yes, if you live in the US, you do have to deal with the problems related to these demographics. So, yes, but so what? Like, are you going to physically remove these demographics anytime soon? I'm holding my breath on that one. Are you going to bring back Jim Crow anytime soon? I'm holding my breath on that one. So, yes, these demographics are issues, and it's like these demographics do correlate heavily to many of these issues in the US. But my point is, okay. And if you live in the US, you have to deal with these problems. So that just reinforces my point. But my second point is that while it is true much of the time, it is not always true. Even states with low Black, Hispanic, or Native American populations often do have the same issues, and often red states. In particular, West Virginia, despite being an overwhelmingly white state, performs terribly on many of these metrics. So now West Virginia, to be fair, is by and large an outlier among whites for many of these statistics, as well as parts of Eastern Kentucky. I do acknowledge that, but what I'm trying to say here is that while race is an issue, I don't see it as the only issue. I see it as being partly systemic. Like, many of these issues have to do fundamentally with the way the American economy is set up and the way that American society is set up in terms of the overall culture, which relates heavily to the economy and the culture of individualism. And we can see this in how even some of the states with low Black or Hispanic populations still do badly on some of these metrics, like West Virginia in particular, but also others for certain metrics. And also, keep in mind, the rest of the Western world isn't totally white anymore either. Like, the idea that the EU, it's funny how Americanists in this one context will act like other Western countries are still totally white. Like, when it comes to like America doing badly, they'll be like, oh, that's because we're less white. It's like, but the rest of the time they'll claim that they're more white. So it's really hypocritical. But yeah, I mean, it's not like other Western countries are totally white anymore. And there are significant Black populations in many of these countries that have many of the same social problems as in the United States, not to mention the indigenous populations in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And in Europe, obviously we have Islamic, like Middle Eastern populations that have many of the same social problems, although interestingly, the Middle Eastern populations in Canada and the US don't seem to have the same social problems to anywhere near the same extent. I'm not so sure about Australia and New Zealand. I am not as familiar with that population there. But yeah, now I'm going to go over these metrics one by one. And the first is obesity rate. Now, for the list of countries by obesity rate, we can see that the United States does quite poorly by the standards of the developed world or the world in general, frankly. The United States is number 18, according to Wikipedia, from WHO 2024 statistics. It's number 18 in the world. The vast majority of the countries above the US seem to be Pacific Island countries, so I guess there's some truth to that stereotype that they just are really fat. There's not a single Western country that is higher than the United States. And when I say Western countries, I mean basically like countries that are white majority or recently have been. So basically, Europe, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand. You could throw in, like, I don't know. For some of these metrics, it depends which white countries you're looking at. Like, some of them, like Russia or Argentina or Uruguay, might do worse, but some they don't. So those ones vary a bit. But my point is, when you look at first world Western countries, yeah, that's how I'm defining it here. But yeah, in this case, obesity, US is by far the worst of any Western country, any white majority country, any first world country. I mean, unless you count some of these Caribbean countries as first world just because they have a high income, but they're not, I don't think they're really considered first world in most regards. But yeah, it's not really close. Like, when looking at other white majority or Western countries, like I guess the next closest would be Georgia if you count that. Chile is not a white majority country, but some people think it is. It's kind of close. Argentina's a few percentage points behind, but when looking for like first world white majority Western countries, like, I mean, the next close, I mean, Hungary is kind of borderline first world, and it's like 5% lower than the US. Like, US is at almost 42%. Hungary's at like 37%. And then we see like if we're talking like bona fide first world Western countries, okay, the next highest is New Zealand at 35%. So the US is considerably higher. Like, it definitely performs the worst in this regard, no matter what way you slice it, of like Western and or first world countries. And a lot of the other ones are significantly lower. Like, when you go down the list, many European countries, even Canada's far lower at 27%. European countries are often cluster in the 20s. Some of them even in the 10s. Yeah, this is like, yeah, US performs terribly in this metric. And the World Obesity Observatory provides similar results. It provides similar statistics according to its findings. And again, Wikipedia, they link to the WHO page, so I'll link to that too. Now, when looking at the data by state, red states do significantly worse. There's definitely a significant correlation here. The worst states overwhelmingly tend to be Southern and Midwestern and Great Plains states. So overwhelmingly red states are the worst. There's some exceptions here and there, like for some reason Florida is less bad. Tennessee is the one state for which there's no data. I don't know why, but judging by the states surrounding it, I'm guessing that Tennessee is probably pretty bad also, because the states surrounding it are a lot of the worst of the worst. So yeah, again, like, US does not do well in this metric, and red states in particular do badly. Like, a lot of people promote the whole like, oh, Trigley puff, like the idea that like liberals, leftists are fat, but statistically it's actually right-wingers who are fatter. And I've seen studies that show this broken down by political affiliation, political belief also. Like, right-wingers in general are fatter, at least in the United States. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's true globally as well. I would not be surprised at all. If anything, being skinny is kind of seen as liberal coded in many contexts. Now, the next method is traffic accident deaths per capita. So any kind of death related to a car accident, be it of the driver or pedestrians or what have you. Now, in this case, the US doesn't do as badly as obesity, but it still does terribly by the standards of first world Western countries. Like, basically, first world, there is no first world white majority country that is worse than the US in this regard. Like, I'm looking at the list here. It's the ones at the top are all basically third world countries, third world or like second world. I'm trying to see what's the worst white majority country. And by the way, when I'm talking about white majority countries, I'm just assuming the statistics from several years ago, because it's possible that like US, Canada, and New Zealand may not even be white majority anymore. So I'm going by like, historically white majority as of the last few decades. Okay, I can't find, let's see, is there any white majority country worse than the US? No. And no first world countries other than like if you're counting the Arab Gulf states, like there's debates over whether those are truly considered first world. But yeah, compared to anywhere in the European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, etc., like US is definitely the worst. 14.2 per 100,000. Now let's see. What's the next? Okay, Bosnia is the next worst white majority country at 13.7, and Armenia, if you count them as white, 13.6. Yeah, there's a lot of controversy about that, but that's another issue. Uruguay next, 13.0. So none of these first world countries, but yes, white majority, or arguably in Armenia's case. Then Georgia, 12.4. We have several also with significant white minorities, like Kazakhstan at 12.7. Now, Brazil has a significant white minority. It is higher than the US at 15.7. Let's see. Georgia, 12.4. Albania at 10.8. Russia and Ukraine almost identical, funny enough. 10.6, 10.5. Latvia at 9.8. Romania 9.6. Montenegro 9.1. Argentina 8.8. Croatia 8.1. Oh, Bulgaria 8.4. Croatia 8.1. Moldova 7.9. Chile, which people often mistakenly think is majority white, 7.7. Belarus 7.4. Serbia 7.4. New Zealand 7.3. So, like, yeah, you get a bunch below this as well. The overall for Europe is 6.7. So, my point is, like, many of the European countries, are their car accident death rates are in, like, the 6 or 5 or 4 per 100,000 range, or even 3 or 2. Whereas United States is 14. So US does way worse than most of the other than all the other white majority countries and almost all first world countries, depending on how you define first world. And on the state-by-state level, it's overwhelmingly red states that are the worst. Again, with New Mexico being the outlier. But if you look at the worst states like Mississippi, Arkansas, New Mexico, South Carolina, Alabama, Wyoming, Montana, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arizona, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, West Virginia, Florida, Texas, Nevada. Okay, this is like, yeah, it's not even close. Like, red states utterly dominate the worst states on this list. And the bottom of the list is entirely like blue states, like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, DC, New Jersey, Hawaii, Utah being the one exception once again. Minnesota, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Washington, Maryland, Illinois, New Hampshire, Alaska. Okay, so there we're getting into kind of like the middle where it's mixed. But yeah, this is not even close. Like, there's a huge red-blue correlation on car accident fatality rate. It is, and Mississippi is terrible. Mississippi would cluster with a lot of like third world, like African countries on this. This is horrendous. And yes, a lot of the states with the worst rates do have high black populations, or in New Mexico's case, Hispanic and Native American. But like, some of these are still fairly white states, like Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota. Yeah, some West Virginia. So yeah, I mean, it seems to be a huge red state correlation here. And again, when they say like, oh, it's because of race entirely, okay, it's not like the blue states are like totally white. Like, I mean, a lot of blue states have significant non-white populations also. I mean, when you look at states like, say, New York or New Jersey or Illinois, or California, like, these are states with very large non-white populations. And yet New York and New Jersey and Illinois all did pretty well by American standards on this particular metric, like car accident deaths per capita. So it's not clearly just a diversity problem. It seems to be an American problem and a red state problem. In some cases, yes, like places that are heavily black do seem to do badly, but it's clearly that's not all that's going on here. Now, for drug overdose deaths per capita, that's the next metric I'm looking at. Okay, this is hard to find reliable data on because what I'm seeing here, it only lists certain countries and it seems to be very selective in which countries it's listing. It has the US as the worst by a significant margin, but there's a lot of countries it doesn't list. Nonetheless, it seems to list like, okay, in terms of first world Western countries, it lists like Portugal, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany, Spain, New Zealand, Hungary, Lithuania, borderline, Norway, Estonia, borderline, Australia, Finland, UK, Sweden, Iceland, and then US. So, I mean, it lists most of them, but maybe not all. But nonetheless, it doesn't, US doesn't come out well. But I will concede that in this case, there's a bit of selection bias. Like, is that the right term, selection bias? They're being selective in which countries they're including. Now, interestingly, when looking at it by state, there's no definitive red or blue state correlation in terms of drug overdose deaths per capita. Now, the thing is, when looking at drug overdoses, like really what I want to look at is drug addiction, but that's just harder to measure, which is why drug overdoses seems to be the best actual metric to use. Drug addiction as a whole is a lot harder to measure, but I would guess from what I've seen, like going around different countries as a tourist, I do see more drug addicts I would actually say US and Canada compared to in Europe. Like US and Canada both seem worse in that regard. Canada does seem to have significantly fewer overdoses per capita. Like according to statistics here, it's 193 in Canada versus 324 in US. That's death rate per 1 million in 2022, overdose or drug related. So it's not just overdoses, but other drug related deaths. That being said, deaths doesn't paint the whole picture in terms of the actual rate of addiction and in terms of the social impact of addiction. Because a lot of the social impact is just like what you see day to day. And in my experience, both Canada and US are pretty bad in that regard. So I'll say this one's a bit less easy to quantify in that regard, but it seems to me like in my experience that North America is worse, like both Canada and the US. Now, in terms of homelessness, in my experience, this seems to be similar, but according to official statistics, US is actually less bad than many European countries in that regard, but it could be because of how homelessness is quantified. By state, actually, blue states are worse than red states in this metric. Nonetheless, in terms of like visible, like for instance, it could be that there's more homeless people in many European countries, but they're not as like visibly homeless because maybe they're better cared for at shelters or whatever. I'm not sure. But in terms of like visibly homeless people, US and Canada, in my experience, seem to be a lot worse than European countries. Australia is, in my experience, seem to be more similar to US and Canada in that regard as well. Like just from being in Sydney, there did seem to be a fair number of homeless people there. In my experience in Europe, the only cities that seemed especially bad for homelessness were Paris and Naples. But yeah, overall, like homelessness, again, this statistically doesn't make US look as bad as many other statistics, but the statistics may not paint the full picture here. And yes, in this regard, as with drug addiction, Canada is also pretty bad. So again, higher education costs, this is the next metric. So the cost of college or university, it's not like, okay, this study, it definitely has a certain bias in terms of who it's selecting. Like it has it's being very selective. It's not including every Western or first world country or even close, but it still has the US as by far the worst in terms of the costs of college or university programs, from what I've heard, yes, the US is much worse with that, especially for like the more prestigious institutions. But even on average, it is significantly worse. University college tuition in the US is known to be just incredibly expensive. And many people just straight up can't afford it. So that is a major issue in the United States. And anecdotally, like Americans do complain about this all the time about how expensive college or university is there. Next metric is vacation time. The US is the only country where by law people are not guaranteed any vacation time. And from statistics I've seen, a lot of people do get like 2 weeks vacation, but that's still like nothing compared to most of the Western world. Actually, Canada does terribly in this metric too. We're guaranteed 2 weeks vacation time, and that's most that all of us get. Sorry, that's all that most of us get. But yeah, US, you're not even guaranteed that. So vacation time wise, like US does terribly. And certain people are like, oh, well, I get 3 or 4 weeks vacation. It's like, good for you. You're an outlier. Statistically, most Americans get only 2 weeks, and there's a significant minority that get even less than that. So yeah, on average, Americans do terribly in that regard. Now, some people will say, oh, that's a good thing because it forces people to be productive. That's a separate debate. But again, if we're talking quality of life, if you consider time off to be a positive thing, then the US does terribly in that metric. Yeah, actually, in terms of vacation time by country, every country in Europe is guaranteed at least it's 4 or 5 weeks vacation. Like every single country in Europe, using the broadest definition, except unless you're going to count Turkey as Europe, then no. But every country in Europe by most definitions of Europe, and then plus Australia and New Zealand. So really, yeah, the ones that do poorly in vacation time, it's US is the worst because they guarantee none. And on average, they get like 2 weeks, which again, not everybody does. Some people get less than that or nothing. Uruguay actually, yeah, they get 4 weeks by the look of it. Argentina looks like only 2 weeks there. So Argentina doesn't do well in this regard either. But yeah, still, US is the worst on this metric. So US and then Canada and Argentina aren't much better. And then every country in Europe, like by the broadest definition of Europe, with the exception of Turkey, if you'd count them. Well, Turkey still looks like they get 3 weeks. And then, yeah, Uruguay, Australia, New Zealand all get 4 or 5 weeks. So all of Europe minus Turkey, if you'd count them. And then Uruguay, Uruguay, Australia, and New Zealand all get 4 or 5 weeks. So yeah, US does terribly in this regard. Now the next is healthcare spending per capita. Now in terms of public and private combined healthcare spending per capita, US dwarfs every other country in the world. Now that being said, some people argue, well, yeah, but a lot of this spending goes toward healthcare innovation. It does, but at the same time, I mean, it's hard to quantify exactly how much each individual person pays for healthcare, but US is known to be bad in this regard. Like when taking into account both tax dollars and also private health spending, like Americans on an individual basis do spend a lot of money on healthcare. So like, again, I would say this is a flawed metric because some of the spending here might include like money that goes towards scientific research that potentially benefits everyone, including people in the US and elsewhere. But nonetheless, like I'd say anecdotally from what I've heard, like Americans do spend a lot of money on healthcare, like out of pocket. And it seems to dwarf what people in many other first world countries spend when you include like both taxes and private expenditures. And yeah, I mean, anecdotally, a lot of Americans do talk about not being able to afford healthcare and not having coverage. It seems like it's easy to slip through the cracks in that regard. That being said, like people in other countries will complain about waiting lists, about not being able to receive healthcare soon enough. I guess it's one of those pick your poison things. Is it worse to be able to afford healthcare but have to wait for it, or to not be able to afford it, or to be barely able to afford it to the point where it's like you have to weigh it against other expenses. I don't know what's worse overall, but in terms of at least healthcare spending, the US they do spend the most by a considerable margin. Again, that's including both public and private spending. Next metric, this is a related one, life expectancy. By the standards of developed countries, US does pretty terribly in this metric. According to UN statistics for 2023, United States is at number 55 globally. Now, there are some white majority countries that are lower and some that are like borderline first world, like Estonia, Poland, Croatia, Slovakia, Uruguay. Those are all ones that are like white majority countries that are like borderline first world that are lower than the United States. And Hungary also. But yeah, my point is, yes, Latvia, Lithuania, considerably worse actually. But nonetheless, okay, it's not the worst in this regard. But in terms of countries that are considered like upper level first world, like definitively first world, that are white majority, US is the worst, like compared to like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. For some reason, Eastern Europe doesn't do too great in life expectancy. Even the wealthier former Warsaw Pact Eastern European countries like Estonia, for instance, or Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia, Hungary, Poland, etc. I'm not sure exactly why. Is it alcohol related? I'm not sure. But yeah, US does not do great in this regard. Their average life expectancy is 79.3. Compare it to like many European countries. Most like the Western European countries seem to be like in the low 80s. Like a lot of them in like the 81, 82, 83 range. The highest of any country is, well, any actual country is Japan, almost 85. Of any white majority actual country, Switzerland at 84. So, I mean, the difference isn't that great. Like, it's like, oh, 3 or 4 years, whatever. But it's like, that does matter when considering it's a weighted average. And the variation can be a lot more for individual people. And yeah, I would say living 3 to 5 extra years, I would say that does make a difference overall. Yes, it does. It is significant. So yeah, life expectancy, United States does not do terribly well in this regard. Now, when looking at it by state, once again, red states do worse. Now, okay, unfortunately, these statistics by state seem to be from the COVID years. Let me just see, okay, what's the one from 2019? I'm going to go with that because anything from 2020 or 2021, I kind of disregard a bit because of that. Shit, I said the fucking C word. Oh, what a dumb cunt I am. I said the C word. I hope that this doesn't get taken down for that. I said the name of the nasty virus. Okay. When looking at the 2019 statistics, I'm going to go with 2019 over 2020 or 2021, despite it being less recent because that was not during the virus years. Okay, so the ones at the top are California, Hawaii, New York, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Washington State, Colorado, Vermont, Utah, Oregon. Okay, so overwhelmingly blue states at the top of the list. Sure enough, Utah is the outlier, as I mentioned. When looking at the bottom of the list, okay, Mississippi, West Virginia, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, South Carolina, New Mexico, Missouri, Ohio, Indiana, Georgia, North Carolina, Wyoming. Okay, so once again, yeah, red states overwhelmingly at the bottom of the list, and not just the heavily black red states. And once again, New Mexico is the outlier. As I mentioned, like Utah and New Mexico are very often the two outliers for opposite reasons in these trends. So yeah, red states doing terribly once again. Mississippi's life expectancy 74.4. That's terrible. The highest is some of them are above 80. So California at 80.9 and then Hawaii 80.9. So tied for number one. So those would be on par with much of like Western Europe, although a bit lower than some, but still within the ballpark of Western Europe. Now these statistics for all the countries are from 2023, but as I said, on a state level, I was using the 2019 statistics. However, it looks like they specifically compared 2019 to 2023 on these statistics, and U.S. as a whole improved by 0.39%, or is it, no, 0.39 years between 2019 and 2023. So not that big a difference. So I guess the 2019 statistics by state would still be fairly applicable to post-pandemic statistics in general. Now, the next statistic is police killings, your chance of being killed by the police. Now, granted, this is offset by the fact that many of the people killed by police are blacks. But nonetheless, it's not like this doesn't happen to white people. I mean, look at the Daniel Shaver killing. That was horrific in Arizona, a white guy there. Like, there's been plenty of high-profile cases of police brutality where a white person was the victim. I actually did a video on that once, so in the United States. So yeah, now this list is not very comprehensive because a lot of countries are not included, but of the countries included, US is the worst for any first world white majority country at 33.1 per 10 million. It's odd that it's per 10 million. Now, Uruguay is actually worse, which is a white majority country that I guess is not usually considered first world, but kind of in a gray area at 35.1. But when we look at the countries below the US, Argentina, Malta, Canada, Luxembourg, Australia, France, Belgium, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Finland, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, Czech Republic, United Kingdom, Poland, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, Croatia, all significantly lower. Significantly lower. And this is from, how recent is this data? Let's see. Okay, so it says the years here. A lot of this is from like the 2010s, so it's not that recent compared to some of the other data for per capita. Like, so this one, again, the data here is not the best, but nonetheless, I mean, it goes with what people say anecdotally. Like, the US is just known for having more brutal police than a lot of other Western countries, more trigger happy, quicker to use violence, and in many cases deadly violence. So yeah, I mean, yes, I would say the US is worse in this regard. Whether or not you view it as justified, like in some cases, yes, it is justified, but clearly not all cases, because like there have been certain videos like the Daniel Shaver in Arizona that are just absolutely horrific, and it's like some of this violence is clearly quite excessive. And there's also a source that shows police killings per capita by U.S. state. And once again, red states are worse on average, with the exception of New Mexico. New Mexico seems to be by far the worst state in the entire U.S. for this. And Alaska. Okay. I guess wherever Jesse Pinkman is, cop killings happen. Maybe they're trying to find Jesse and they kill someone else in the process. But yeah, New Mexico and Alaska. But yeah, as a whole, red states do seem to be worse, and they have this data for numerous years, and it seems to be the same pattern year by year. Red states along with New Mexico. Now, the next metric is white population, because, again, race comes up in many of these debates. Whether or not you consider higher white population to be objectively a good or bad thing is beside the point, because race does come up in many of these debates. So regardless of your personal feelings on race, I do want to include this simply because it's a significant component of these debates. When people are arguing America's the best country, they often do argue it based on the premise that the US is whiter. Whether or not you think that's a good or bad thing is beside the point. Now, US in terms of non-Hispanic white, as of the 2020 census, almost 58%, or according to an American Community Survey in 2024, more recent, 56%. Now, whether or not you consider alleged white Hispanics in the US to be white is a tricky issue because many Hispanics will identify as white because it's the only racial option. They don't give mestizo as an option. So some of them will just check off white when really mestizo would be a better category for them. So like, I don't know. It's confusing. Like whether or not white Hispanics, according to the official statistics, are legitimately white is a very complicated question. I do believe, yes. I mean, there are white Hispanics. Like there are some Hispanic people who are objectively white by any definition. But are the statistics reliable in this regard by self-defined white people, including white Hispanics? Perhaps not. Also, the United States officially considers Middle Easterners broadly to be white. According to official statistics, like all Middle Easterners, including Arabs and Jews and what have you, are considered white officially. So that's also an issue. The actual number might be higher or lower than this. The statistics in Canada, on the other hand, the most recent census in Canada, 2021, has whites as 68.5% of the population. That said, it's definitely considerably lower now because there was a shit ton of immigration from the third world, especially India, the Indian subcontinent, in the years following 2021. So basically 2022 to like 2024, more or less, there was just a lot of it, an absolute shit ton. So the statistics would be significantly lower now, but like for the white population. But is Canada or the US whiter? I can't confidently say. At this point, they're both in the same ballpark. Now, unfortunately, other Western countries don't really take reliable racial statistics. Australia and New Zealand actually stopped in their most recent census asking about race. They now only ask about national origins, so it's way more confusing in that regard. I'm not sure if any continental European country asks about race. I know France has like actually banned the taking of racial statistics. According to the 2021/2022 census, the UK is 83% white. So that's significantly higher than the US or Canada. And okay, so the only thing that's suspicious here, they're including Roma gypsies as white, but that's only like 0.1% of the population, so whatever. Now, Ireland does take racial statistics. In 2022, the white population is 87.4%. Once again, they include Roma gypsies as white, but that's only 0.31%. So, yeah, not a huge difference either way. So 87% white, 87.4% white in Ireland as of 2022. So US, and again, like by most anecdotally, most people will agree that the EU as a whole is whiter than the United States significantly. Even though the EU is definitely less white than it used to be and the non-white population is growing significantly. So yeah, I mean, racially speaking, US is probably less white than than any other, like any Western European country. Probably less than Australia. Canada or New Zealand are more debatable. And almost certainly less white than any Eastern European country. Yes, by any definition. So, any reasonable definition. So, yeah. US is one of the least white today of any Western countries. And again, if you're going to compare it to like Argentina or Uruguay, that gets very confusing there. Their statistics. I would guess Argentina might be in the same ballpark as US, Canada, and New Zealand in that regard. Uruguay probably significantly whiter. Now, obviously, again, this depends on your definition of white, because it's like you get the one-drop rule types, and then you get the types who are like might have a very strict standard like 99 or 98%. And some people might be stricter on certain types of non-white DNA than others. So I would concede if you're using a strict Nordicist definition, like a very strict definition of white, which would be stricter than what most people would use, it's possible that the US would be higher than many other countries, like say Southern or Eastern European or like Southern cone like Argentina or Uruguay in that regard. But if you're using the definition of white that like most people would use, like most people would probably use the definition like, I don't know, like 90% white or whatever. Like for a person to be white, they must be like 90% or whatever white or something like that. By that definition, then yes, the US would be one of the lower Western countries. And even by a more Nordicist definition, like still many countries within Europe, like within Northwestern Europe, would be significantly higher than the US, like the Scandinavian, German, British Isles, etc. would be higher. Probably Australia also. And probably many of the Northeastern European countries as well, like Poland and what have you. But again, most people do not define whiteness by like Nordicist terms that are like, absolute one drop rule or like 99% or something extremely strict like that. But yeah. So another issue I'm going to look at is prison rape. Now, this is impossible to find reliable statistics on, but the United States anecdotally is known for this, like having high rates of rape in prisons. And it seems to be widely tolerated by many members of the public. Many people even find it hilarious, and it's often joked about in movies and TV shows. I cannot statistically back this one up, but I will say the US is sus in this regard because it's just talked about so much in association with it. So again, I cannot statistically verify this one, but it still merits mention. The sheer ubiquity of rape in American prisons. Now, okay, next on the list is homicide rate. Now, some of the statistics for other countries are out of date, especially for like third world countries. The United States, like on the Wikipedia page, what it has here is 5.7, but I know that's out of date. I know it's actually closer to 4 per 100,000 more recently. Like it's actually been the lowest homicide rate in many decades. I think it was 2025, the most recent year they have it for. So it has been going down. But nonetheless, according to these statistics, it is still higher than every first world white majority country. Like if you compare it to any like EU country or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it is significantly higher still. Like the highest in the EU according to these statistics is Latvia at 2.8, then Lithuania at close to 2.7, and Canada is actually at 2.0, and then Estonia is I think 1.8, but most of the first world white majority countries are far lower. Like most of the countries in Europe are like closer to 1.0. A lot of them are actually beneath 1.0. Even some of the Eastern European countries like Bosnia is below 1.0. So yeah, many of them are like most European countries, and not to mention Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all significantly lower than the US in homicide rate, even though the US has its lowest homicide rate in decades right now. Now, there are some white majority countries that are not really first world that are comparable to the US in this regard, like Ukraine. The most recent statistic is 3.8. That's from 2021, before the war. I don't even know how you'd count war deaths in homicide rates. Argentina's at 3.9. Now that statistic is from 2024, so pretty recent. And Russia's at 7.8. So that's from 2024. That is pretty recent. That is during the war. Uruguay, 11.2. That's pretty bad. So yes, there are white majority countries that are worse than the US in this regard, or on par. Like Uruguay and Russia are significantly worse. Ukraine and and Argentina are on par. Although, again, I don't know what the hell you'd do for Ukraine right now with the war and everything, how you'd count that. But as far as like first world white majority countries, like when you look at like the Western European countries or anywhere in the EU, plus Canada, Australia, New Zealand, US dwarfs them in terms of homicide rate. Never even mind countries like Japan or South Korea. Like, forget it. So even though it has been going down in the US, which is definitely a good thing, the US still does dwarf other first world Western countries in this regard. Now, when looking at homicide rates by state, again, red states generally are worse. Like a lot of the worst ones, like let's see. Well, like, okay, District of Columbia, fair enough, blue. Louisiana, New Mexico, Alabama, Tennessee, Missouri, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alaska, Georgia, Oklahoma, Nevada, Kentucky. So, like, the top of the list is overwhelmingly dominated by red states. Again, with New Mexico being an outlier, and DC, which, yeah, not really a state per se, but fair enough. Nonetheless, though, dominated by red states, mostly southern states. Well, Maryland is in there. Okay, that's an exception. Blue. But still, like mostly southern, mostly with a fairly large black population, but not entirely because, for instance, Alaska's there. That would be more, again, Native American population would be disproportionately overrepresented in these statistics. Oklahoma, not sure entirely what's going on there demographically with these homicides. But yeah, Oklahoma's number 13, so it's not super high on the list. Alaska's 11. But yeah, the ones near the top of the list, overwhelmingly red states, but also overwhelmingly southern. In this regard, yes, I do think it's mostly to do with the black demographics, which is why a lot of these red states are pretty high. And yeah, Maryland is an outlier for being a blue state that's high on the list, but again, that is high black population. So it seems like high black or Native American, like in the case of Alaska. And the Native Americans do actually also have a fairly high homicide rate. Although, interestingly, I think they're the only group where they have a higher homicide rate in Canada than in the United States. Native Americans in Canada have quite a high homicide rate. Now, I'm curious about why Oklahoma's high. It says, according to the 2020 census, Oklahoma's 12% Hispanic, 8.4% Native, 7.3% Black. So, like, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. And also, how bad is, like, drug addiction there? I am not sure. But yeah, Oklahoma is fairly high on the list. Yeah, it's at number 13. But then, and yeah, as always, New Mexico is the blue state. That's the exception near the top of the list. But let's say at the bottom of the list, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Idaho, Massachusetts, Iowa, Rhode Island, Nebraska, New Jersey, Maine, Wyoming, Connecticut, Utah, North Dakota, Montana, New York. So that's like the bottom 15 there. So a mix of red and blue states. I'd say a lot of states that are fairly white, but not always, because there's exceptions there, like Hawaii. Let's see, Hawaii, New Jersey. Like I would say Hawaii, New Jersey, and New York are definitely not. Those would be among the less white states for sure. Like, I'm looking at list of, like, okay, U.S. states by non-Hispanic white percentage. Hawaii is the least white state by this definition, non-Hispanic white. And then New York and New Jersey are 10th and 11th least non-Hispanic white, respectively. So definitely some of the less white states, but still quite low on the homicide rate list. Now, okay, like, I mean, Hawaii, in its case, a lot of it's East Asians, but in the case of New Jersey and New York, like there definitely is a significant Black and Hispanic population in both of those states. So interesting. Not to mention being two of the more urbanized states. Now, I know what a lot of people would say. They'd say, well, homicide isn't the only crime out there. Like, there's other crimes too. And absolutely, that is very true. For other crimes, there's less of a discrepancy between the US and other developed white majority countries. And in fact, in some cases, like robbery, burglary, and theft, many of the EU countries are actually higher than the US per capita. Not only that, but for a lot of these crimes, blue states often tend to be worse than red states. But keep in mind, it's not just homicide that is likely significantly worse in the US, but other certain things that are hard to quantify, such as attempted murder and non-fatal shootings. And keep in mind, 76% of homicides in the United States involve a gun. So, what I'm saying is there's probably also a lot of non-fatal shootings. And that would be something that is a significant detractor in quality of life, just having to worry about that, like bullets flying off all over the place. And yeah, not all these cases are fatal, but you could still potentially get injured, or it's just scary kind of like witnessing it, like hearing gunshots or seeing like bullet holes, like just like shit like that. Like, yeah, it can be scary. So, I mean, that's another thing that's kind of hard to quantify, but is a factor about life in the United States. Also, I'm uncertain whether terrorism is included in homicide rates. I know sometimes it's not, because I remember for 2001, they did not include 9/11 in like New York City homicide rates. So it's like, that's another aspect, but it's like, okay, if you're going to look at terrorism, I mean, both Europe and the US have had their fair share of it, especially when you consider 9/11. Like, that attack dwarfs every other terrorist attack in Western countries since by a considerable margin. Like, if you look at all the Islamist terrorist attacks in Europe combined, their death toll probably wouldn't come close to equaling 9/11, especially when you consider the many people who've died since 9/11 based on health complications due to inhaling all the filthy, disgusting shit that was in the air as the result of the towers collapsing. Like, those deaths have actually eclipsed the death toll on 9/11 itself by a considerable margin. So, yeah, if you're going to talk about terrorism, it's like US would probably be worse than Europe for per capita deaths just because of 9/11 itself. Like, 9/11 was just so monumentally high in its death toll compared to other terrorist attacks since. Now, next metric is going to be one, okay, I can't quantify this. I don't have statistics on this. It's hard to quantify, but the healthiness of the food. I mean, I've talked about life expectancy and obesity rate, which would both correlate to it, but the US is known for having more lax laws on certain unhealthy food additives. And listen, it's not like they don't have unhealthy food in Europe, or we don't have unhealthy food in Canada. Like, poutine is not known for being a healthy food, that's for damn sure. And I mean, in Europe, look at the francesinha in Portugal. That's one of the most decadent things ever. But the big difference is that the US allows certain additives in food, like certain specific ingredients that are often not allowed in other developed countries. Also, I would say American food tends to be probably just more unhealthy even without the additives, simply because a lot of American food is very rich. But I will concede there is rich food. Like, you can get plenty of rich food in other countries too, like other Western countries. It's just that in America, it tends to be, I would say, even more so par for the course, and the portion sizes at restaurants tend to be bigger. But I think the biggest factor here is the additives. Like, and that's the thing. It's like, I'm not saying that unhealthy food is like only in the US, or even that it's inherently a bad thing. Like, I love eating the occasional unhealthy meal that is extremely delicious. But I will say this. There are certain additives that are just so dangerous, and they probably don't even add that much to the taste, or you could use something else and get a pretty similar taste. And I really question why some of these additives are even legal. Like, Like a good example, there's a chemical called potassium bromate that is used in New York style pizza often, and it's banned in most other Western countries. And it's like I've had New York style pizza in here in Canada that's pretty damn good. Is it really necessary to have the potassium bromate? Like from what I've read, this shit is like really bad. And yes, I've had New York style pizza in New York City also, so I've probably consumed some potassium bromate in my life while in the United States. But I'm just saying, like, U.S. is known for having more lax laws on unhealthy food additives. And again, I'm not even saying that I advocate like banning, like, oh, we can't have unhealthy food. What I'm saying is why do they have to allow certain specific additives that probably aren't even necessary? Like, you could make the same foods without these additives. Like, that's my question. Like, we have poutine in Canada, but without these additives. We have, similar foods in Canada, like New York style pizza, Chicago style pizza. We do have them in Canada, but probably without certain additives that you might have in the United States. Like, as I said, potassium bromate or whatever else potentially. And that is something the US is known for, just being more lax on these things than other Western countries. And I do think that is part of the reason for their worse outcomes in terms of like life expectancy, health, obesity, etc. And again, I'm not even saying you can't have unhealthy food, but I'm saying there are certain additives specifically that are just so damn bad. It's like, why not just get rid of some of these additives? The next thing on the list, again, harder to quantify, but public transit. I mean, I guess you could quantify it in terms of like the number of trips people take on transit, but the number of trips people take on transit doesn't necessarily indicate the quality or quantity of the transit system. It could just mean it's there, but people choose not to take it. But when looking at the coverage, like when looking at the Amtrak rail map of intercity passenger rail in the US versus the U-Rail map of intercity rail in Europe, like it's not even close. Like the European system is way more extensive in terms of where it goes. Also, I would say in terms of frequency, I'd say yes. Overall in terms of like how frequently the trains come. Comparing US to Europe, Europe definitely kicks America's ass in terms of public transit, in terms of just the quality and quantity of the transit. Probably in terms of safety as well, when keep in mind a lot of transit in the US has a lot of problems with like homeless people, drug addicts, criminals, stuff of that nature. Europe does have some problems with like sexual harassment on public transit, but like, and pickpocketing, but like, I feel like the US is a lot worse in terms of like homelessness and drug addiction on transit. Like, people with mental health issues creating a disturbance for others, things like that. Now, yes, Canada does have a lot of these problems too. Like, and also in terms of the overall quality of the transit, I would say Canada, Australia, New Zealand probably would be somewhere in between the US and Europe overall. I would say actually, Australia and New Zealand would probably be better than Canada in that regard from what I've experienced of the public transit in Sydney. That's the only city in Australia where I've been on the transit, and I haven't been to New Zealand at all. But yeah, I would say Australia is probably better than Canada in that regard. And from what I've seen on maps, I would guess New Zealand probably is too. Where Canada really loses out is in intercity passenger rail. Like, we're not bad in terms of intra-city by the standards of like non-Europe Western countries, but where we lose out is intercity. Like, Canada's pretty bad in that regard. Like, the fact that we don't have passenger rail between Calgary and Edmonton is a complete joke. I mean, there's no passenger rail that goes to Calgary from other cities at all. Calgary has passenger rail within the city, but none that goes to other cities, which is utterly ridiculous. Now, the US might still be worse than Canada in this regard, simply because there's a lot more large cities that just don't have any passenger rail, like cities like Columbus, for instance, intra-city or intercity. I think Columbus has none. San Antonio has none, although I think they are actually building a light rail there. Louisville has no passenger rail of any kind, intercity or intra-city. Neither does Nashville. So when considering the size of these metropolitan areas, like Columbus, Louisville, Nashville, not having any kind of public transit is pretty terrible. Like no light rail, no Amtrak intercity rail connections to other cities, nothing. Never mind a subway system. Like nothing. And like Canada's passenger rail system is lacking in many ways, but we don't have any cities of even close to that size without any kind of passenger rail in the metropolitan area. The largest we do would be Quebec City and Winnipeg, which are both in the area of, I think, like 700, 800,000 people in the entire metropolitan area. So much smaller than these American metropolitan areas that completely lack it. Not to mention I think they are at least proposing a light rail system in Quebec City. I'm not sure if they're building it yet. Definitely long overdue. And definitely enough demand. But yeah, and Winnipeg, fuck all. Winnipeg's pretty bad, like in that regard and in many regards. But yeah, overall though, I think US in terms of public transit is probably worse than Canada. That said, I will say the best parts of the US would be better than the best parts of Canada. Like New York City would have way better public transit than any Canadian city. I would say the Boswash corridor as a whole has better transit than any region of Canada, both intercity and intracity. Like, okay, intracity, Toronto might be on par with like, or perhaps better than Boston or Philadelphia. I would say not as good as DC. I'd say DC beats Toronto in its subway system for sure. And obviously so does New York City. But overall, though, I think the Boswash corridor is better for public transit than any region of Canada, including the Windsor to Quebec City corridor. That said, though, I think Canada is better overall because when you look at the American average, like it's terrible. And there are some cities that are just like, for a city of its size to not have any kind of rail public transit, like no light rail, no Amtrak, nothing, like cities like Columbus or Louisville or Nashville, it's just kind of pathetic. Like, frankly, in this day and age, it's embarrassing. It's fucking embarrassing that cities like metropolitan areas of that size completely lack any kind of intra-city or intercity passenger rail. It is pathetic. Now again, next metric, lack of historic architecture. This one's harder to quantify, but I will say, okay, compared to Europe, okay, I'm sorry, Europe on average, like obviously it's not the same in every European country, but Europe on average would blow the United States out of the water in this regard. Most of the inland US has hardly any historic neighborhoods to speak of. Like in terms of areas of the US with actual historic architecture of value, where it's not just a few buildings or like one main street, but like entire neighborhoods, the vast majority of it is on or near the East Coast. So the Boswash corridor, both the major cities and a lot of smaller cities and towns, and even villages, and then like in and near the Boswash corridor, like what I call the greater Boswash corridor. So Boswash and its surroundings, like anywhere within like, I don't know, 100 to whatever, 150, 200, whatever miles of it, give or take. Plus there'd be like Charleston and Savannah and St. Augustine and Key West, which are all on the East Coast, further south. So they on or near the East Coast, the vast majority. And the only outliers I can think of would be like New Orleans, Chicago, San Francisco, among bigger cities. And then there's a few small towns like Galena, Illinois, or Eureka Springs, Arkansas, that would have like historic architecture beyond just like one main street, you know? And I don't know, maybe if I'm being very generous, like Natchez, Mississippi, and Natchitoches, I don't know how you pronounce that, Natchitoches, Louisiana, but those would barely qualify because it's like they have some historic buildings and maybe it's more than like one or two streets, but it's not that much. Like, but yeah, the vast majority of the United States, outside of the coastal regions and those few specific cities and towns, It'll only have like either like you'll have like a town or city with like one main street with historic buildings and maybe like a couple blocks off the main street, but not very much. Um, Scattered historic buildings here and there, but not many cohesive historic neighborhoods. Like not like what you'd find in many European cities and towns where it's just entire neighborhoods, entire large sections of the city are like majority composed of historic, beautiful historic buildings. Um, Now, in this regard, Canada and Australia might be on par with the US. Australia might be worse than the US in this regard. Canada, I'd say, probably on par. So, yeah, other white majority first world countries outside of Europe wouldn't do great in this regard either. New Zealand would definitely do the worst. I would say they don't have much historic architecture to speak of. Um, Argentina or Uruguay might be worse than the US in that regard. Like Buenos Aires is very hit or miss. And outside of Buenos Aires, there's not that many historic neighborhoods as far as I know in Argentina. Montevideo, Uruguay, kind of meh. So yeah, those countries might be Argentina, Uruguay might be worse than the US in that regard overall. Debatable, but yes, probably in the same ballpark. Um, but yeah, the argument by Americans like we don't have as much history as Europe. That's like what they'll say to define like, oh, we're a new country. Like, why don't they have more beautiful architecture? Uh, I would say that's an invalid argument because they had a lot of beautiful architecture that they destroyed in the 50s to 70s to build more car-centric infrastructure during peacetime, no less. So they can't blame it on war. Even if that architecture that they destroyed wasn't on par with like the greatest historic cities of Europe, it was still something. And they still destroyed some very beautiful architecture, like in Boston, like the West End of Boston, that whole neighborhood, not to mention like in New York City, like Penn Station, for instance. Certain large like Art Deco era skyscrapers in New York City and Chicago. Like granted, some of this, like again, these are also the cities that still have the most historic architecture today, but they still destroyed a lot of value there in the past. Not to mention cities like St. Louis. Like St. Louis was like utterly gutted. It had some pretty beautiful historic architecture, maybe not on par with like Boston or New York City, but still pretty beautiful by its own standard. And they destroyed like the vast majority of it. That city was really gutted. And granted, yes, a lot of it was because of changing racial demographics in these cities. But again, we have to ask, why did the racial demographics change? Like a lot of it was by design. The FDR administration and following administrations wanted to encourage whites to move to the suburbs. They did that by giving loans, much bigger loans with the GI Bill to new homeowners rather than to owners of existing homes. Like they deliberately created financial incentives so that anyone with money, which at the time meant white people, would move to the suburbs. Whites and Jews, that they would move to the suburbs. And basically, that's what happened. So they kind of handed over the historic cities to the blacks. But not only that, but they destroyed a lot of stuff to build freeways and parking lots to accommodate suburbanites in the downtown areas. So yeah, I'm sorry, but this is a regard in which the US and frankly other New World white majority countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay fall short compared to Europe in this regard. Because yes, a lot of the same trends happened in like other like Canada, Australia, New Zealand as well. Especially, I would say, especially Canada with like, I'm not so sure about Australia and New Zealand with like the car centrism, how far they went with that. But in Canada, absolutely, we did much of the same destruction of our inner cities on behalf of the automobile. Like there was a lot of that going on in Toronto and cities like Winnipeg and also smaller cities like London, Ontario, fake London, as Not Just Bikes would call it. Fake London was probably one of the worst hit. But yeah, I'm just saying overall, US, not the greatest country in the world in this regard. Like to say it's the best country in the world for historic architecture, it's like better than Italy, better than France, better than Spain. Are you kidding me? Yeah. Even the best cities in the US, like New Orleans, if it was in Spain, Italy, or France, would be like an average city of its size in terms of the architectural beauty. and it wouldn't compete with the best of the best, like, say, Paris or Rome or Barcelona. Now, lack of walkable cities. This kind of goes hand in hand with what I was just saying, but yeah, harder to quantify. But the US, not known for its walkable cities on average. Like, obviously, there's exceptions like New York City. The worst US cities in terms of walkability might actually be worse than the worst cities in like any other Western country. Like, even the worst, like, in terms of larger metropolitan areas, like even the worst cities in like Canada or Australia or New Zealand would still have like some amount of like passenger rail transit. At least cities over 1 million in the metropolitan area. Like, granted, as I mentioned before, cities like Quebec City and Winnipeg would be in the 500,000 to 1 million range, like around like 700, 800,000 now in the metropolitan area. And yeah, that would be embarrassing that they don't have passenger rail. But again, in the US, you have much bigger metropolitan areas than that, like Columbus, Louisville, and Nashville, for instance. So again, going hand in hand with just what I've just said with like architecture and rail transit, like the walkability of the cities themselves, like in terms of just like a lot of middle American cities are very sprawled, even in the inner city, like very car dependent and not a lot of like high density or even medium density housing. Like a lot of cities, it's like there's not that many like townhomes or apartments. Like a city like, say, Oklahoma City, for instance, a lot of it, even in the inner city, is overwhelmingly detached homes. Now, that might be changing in recent years with like more condominiums being built in some of these inner cities or more townhouses. But at the same time, it's not that walkable when a lot of the roads are still very wide and with high speed limits and car oriented, not to mention the lack of public transit, especially rail transit. Because buses kind of suck. When buses are the entire backbone of the transit system in a city, like a city of like over 1 million people in the metropolitan area, it's kind of pathetic. So yeah, I mean, lack of walkable cities. Again, obviously there's exceptions like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, DC, Chicago, San Francisco. But I'm saying overall, American cities aren't that great on average in this regard. Next would be maternal mortality rate. Now, again, these statistics, unfortunately, they're from 2020, so like, yeah, pandemic year. But obviously, okay, the worst countries are overwhelmingly African, like sub-Saharan African countries. But then as you go down the list, you will see United States is the worst out of any first world Western country. At a rate of 21.1 per 100,000. Actually, wait, I could be wrong. It depends on who you count, because if you count them as a first world Western country, Cyprus is significantly worse at 68.4 per 100,000. But again, do you count them as a first world country slash Western country? Also, is that including both Greek and Turkish Cyprus together? I'm pretty sure it's not. I'm pretty sure this is just the Greek part of Cyprus, but I'm not sure. But anyway, okay, Cyprus would be the one exception then. If you're going to, and it would actually be far worse. Cyprus is terrible, actually, for a country with its level of wealth. Actually, it's way worse than Turkey. Turkey's less bad than the United States. So I don't know what's going on there with Cyprus. But as far as like first world Western countries that are definitively like after, I guess if you count Cyprus, then the United States, the next would be, I mean, Hungary is kind of close to first world. It's at 15 per 100,000. And then Portugal would be 11.8, then Canada 11.0. Now, there would be other white majority countries that are not first world that are close to the United States, like Uruguay is 18.6, so that's a bit below the United States. Ukraine 16.5, so yeah, considerably below. Russia 13.7. There's a few that are actually above the United States, so like white majority ones that are not considered first world. Like, I don't know if you consider them white, but like Armenia and Georgia at 27.2, 27.6. And then Argentina at 44.9. That's pretty bad, actually. But if you look at a lot of the European countries on this list are really low, like below 10 even, like say Poland, Iceland, Norway, Belarus, Malta, oh, Australia also. But yeah, in Europe, Spain, Czech Republic, Netherlands. Oh yeah, Japan's low too. But yeah, Germany, Sweden, Slovenia, Italy, Denmark, Slovakia, Croatia, Belgium, Ireland, Estonia, Austria, Bosnia, Montenegro, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Bulgaria, like a lot of these, France, Greece, Switzerland, a lot of these, Finland, Albania, like Lithuania, etc. Like a lot of these European countries are quite low and like below 10, and the United States is 21.1. So, um, I guess, yeah, like by the standards of first world developed, white majority countries, not doing good at all there. Now, if we look at maternal mortality by U.S. state, the statistics I have, okay, it says aggregated from 2019 to 2023. So again, that includes the pandemic years. I don't know how much that offsets it. I don't know how much the virus would have affected maternal mortality. It may have, I don't know. But nonetheless, okay, we can see here that the worst states are red states overwhelmingly. Like a lot of the southern states, like in particular, one thing I've noticed, a lot of statistics, you can see a certain region on the map that always stands out as bad, which is basically like a lot of the Mississippi Delta states and anything nearby. Like, so basically Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia. So it's almost like this map of like the lower Mississippi River states and then others that are kind of nearby. But yeah, a lot of these states do badly on this metric, although not West Virginia and Missouri, not quite as much, but still not great. But yeah, red states overall are worse in this metric. Actually, New Mexico this time does not stand out as terribly bad. Now, there's a few states that don't have statistics for this, but the majority do. So I would say the overall pattern does seem to be that red states are definitely worse. And not just the ones with huge black populations, because we can also see Arizona, Indiana. Arizona and Indiana are both pretty bad. And both of those, I think, have black populations below the national average. So does Kentucky, in fact, despite being a southern state, and despite the fact it used to have a lot of slaves. It has a black population below the national average, but the maternal mortality rate is quite bad there. I'm pretty sure there was some sort of either mass exodus or mass expulsion of slaves or former slaves from Kentucky. I'm not sure the exact history of it, but I know it used to have one of the highest black populations in the U.S., and then for some reason it just has one of the lowest of any southern state now, and has for a while. So I think there was some, I don't know if the blacks, if they left voluntarily or forcibly, but there was some sort of like black mass exodus from Kentucky. I really have to research more into that. It's an interesting little piece of history. So the next mortality rate, the next metric I'm looking at is closely related to maternal mortality, is infant mortality. So it's not just for infants. It's the statistic they have is from World Bank for infants, for any child under 5. So the mortality rate for people under 5 years old. And of course, the countries that are the worst are overwhelmingly sub-Saharan African countries. But scrolling down the list, yeah, the United States is the worst of any it's the worst of any first world white majority country with 6.5 per 1,000 mortality rate for children, young children. And we can see there are some white majority countries that are higher than the U.S. that are not typically considered like developed or first world. Romania at 6.6, Uruguay at 6.7, Ukraine at 8.1. Georgia, if you count them, at 9.2, Argentina 9.6, Armenia, if you count them, 10.0. And this is from 2023, by the way. So these are all post-pandemic statistics. So then below the US, you have like the vast majority of white majority countries, including, if you count them, Cyprus, which is weird because they were so high for maternal mortality, but yet quite low comparatively for young child slash infant mortality. Cyprus is below many Western European countries, so I don't know what the hell's going on there. This is very sus. Like, I'm questioning, is this reliable? But all these other countries, like Canada and the Western European countries, New Zealand, Australia, are all significantly lower than the US, like rates of like 5.1 in Canada's case, and then much lower. A lot of the Western European ones are in the like 2 or 3 or 4 range, so significantly lower infant mortality rates compared to the United States. And again, it's infants plus under 5. And if we look by state, now unfortunately this data is from 2021, so that's during pandemic years, but again, overwhelmingly red states are by far the worst. A lot of the deep south states, but also some of the Midwest ones like Indiana and Ohio. Also South Dakota. And then, yeah, Oklahoma, West Virginia. So, yeah, like overwhelmingly red states are a lot worse on average for infant mortality, according to these statistics. Now, again, this could be skewed by the fact that it was 2021 during the pandemic years, but nonetheless, it seems that, I don't know, it's hard to say, but like, is it just because of the pandemic, or are there other reasons? Like, is it normally that red states are significantly worse for, because I mean, babies didn't often die from that virus. I think it killed more older people. But again, I don't know. Would that still affect infant mortality because of the mother potentially being sick? I don't know. Or because of like strained hospital resources, like indirect reasons. I don't know. But nonetheless, it does show here that like the red states are overwhelmingly worse. Now, the next metric I'm looking at is income inequality. Now, according to the World Bank Gini coefficient statistics, U.S. is definitely the worst of any developed first world white majority country by a significant margin. The U.S. has a Gini coefficient score of 41.8. Next highest for a majority white first world country would be Italy, 34.3. Then Portugal, 33.9. Australia, 33.8. Like, a lot of the Gini coefficients for the European countries are much lower, like in the low 30s. Canada also, on Australia, like I think New Zealand, yeah, like low 30s, high 20s, even getting, yeah, like low 30s, high 20s. Not many. I guess the lowest looks like Slovenia, Belarus at 24. Or Slovakia 23. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, the US, again, high income inequality by the standards of first world Western countries. Now, in terms of non-first world white majority countries, there's a few that are close to the US or worse. Argentina's at 42.4. Uruguay 40.9, so that's close to the US for both of them. US is 41.8. And then let's see. Bulgaria 39.5. Kosovo 38.3, etc. You know, like, so it's like there's a few others, but they're not really first world per se. Lithuania is close to first world. That's like 36.0. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So like most of them would be significantly lower, like any majority white country, and all the developed countries. Period. Actually, like any first world country would be less unequal than the U.S. by these measures, like significantly less so. Now, when looking at income inequality by state, blue states actually seem to be worse on this one. So I guess red staters are vindicated in this regard. But it speaks to a bigger issue, which is like, is income inequality a bad thing? Like, because most people view it as a bad thing, but a significant number on the right don't. A significant number of right wingers would say that income inequality is actually a good thing because it shows that like the high performing people are making even more money. Like the very ambitious hustlers, entrepreneurs, whatever, are absolutely killing it compared to the poor people. So like again, whether or not income inequality is objectively a good or bad thing is up for debate, but I'd say most people think it's a bad thing. And yes, in this statistic, US does worse than other developed countries and almost all other white majority countries, period. Now, in terms of workplace deaths per capita, this is interesting because these statistics are for over 10 years from 2014 to 2024. They're from ILO.org. I'm not sure what exactly this is. Okay, so it seems to be International Labor Organization, and they say that they're the foremost authority on labor stats in the world, self-proclaimed. I don't know, but now these statistics don't seem to cover every country. It's like less than half the countries in the world that are included. But of first world Western countries, or of like any white majority country, let's see, France is at 8.2 per 100,000. So France is actually bizarrely the worst. Ukraine 7.6. Russia 5.0. Armenia, if you count them, 4.2. Cyprus, if you count them, 3.8. Uruguay 3.7, then US also 3.7. But then below US you have Bulgaria 3.5, Latvia 3.5, Argentina 3.0, Portugal 2.9, Czech Republic 2.7, Croatia 2.7, Georgia, if you count them, 2.4, Lithuania 2.4, Romania 2.4, Belarus 2.3, Slovenia 2.3. So like Canada, Spain, Hungary, Switzerland, Australia, Estonia, Iceland, etc. So most of the white majority first world countries are significantly lower than the US in this metric. A lot of them are quite low, actually, like in the 0 or 1 or 2 range. And US is at 3.7, so not terribly high. Lower than its homicide rate, actually. But yeah, the workplace accident death rate is still higher in the US than most first world white countries, although not all, because Cyprus, if you count them, is slightly higher. And then for some bizarre reason, France is way higher. I don't know what the fuck is going on in France there. That is weird. That is really weird. France doesn't normally cluster as being that bad. Maybe there was like 1 or 2 incidents that just killed a lot of workers or something. Like, that seems really bad. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, a few non-first world white majority countries are also higher than the US in this regard. So the US doesn't do the worst in this statistic, but still worse than most compared to its peers. Now, on a state-by-state basis, okay, there's a map by the NSC, nsc.org. What is NSC? National Safety Council. And it looks like, yes, red states are worse. This map is very hard to read because they use almost the exact same color for every gradient, which is really dumb. But the ones that seem to be worse are Wyoming is by far the worst, but then also Alaska and Mississippi, and then North Dakota. And also, it seems like after those would be like Montana, Idaho, South Dakota, Iowa, Arkansas, West Virginia. So like, yeah, red states do seem to be worse in this regard. Now, money is the one regard in which the US usually comes out on top, but one statistic where it doesn't is median wealth. Now, in terms of mean wealth, which is average, US absolutely dominates the world. But in terms of median wealth, it's actually not as great. It's actually kind of like mid-level by the standard of first world Western countries. Like in terms of median wealth, Iceland, Luxembourg, Belgium, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Switzerland, UK, Norway, Canada, France, Netherlands are all above the United States, whereas Spain, Italy, again, I'm only looking at like Western countries here. Spain, Italy, Malta, Ireland, Finland, Sweden, Slovenia, Portugal, Austria, Germany, Greece, Latvia, Montenegro, Cyprus, Slovakia, Estonia, etc. are below the United States. So it's kind of like mid by the level of wealth. Like a lot of the other Anglo countries are higher though, like Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia are all higher. What about Ireland? Ireland is a bit lower. Actually, somewhat lower. Yeah, moderately lower. Okay, so that's median, but in terms of mean, on the other hand, which is average, the United States dominates this. Only Switzerland and Luxembourg are higher out of any countries. And what that means is that a certain minority of rich people utterly inflate the mean, the average for the United States, but the median is actually kind of mid by the standards. Yeah, the median is mid, ironically enough, by the standards of first world Western countries. So yeah, that about covers it for all the statistics I'm looking at where the US just does not do great. But in the interest of fairness, I'm not going to go into as much detail about these, but I will concede that there are some statistics where the US does do great relative to other Western countries. Obviously, GDP per capita, that's the first one people point to. Average income as well. Not wealth, but income. In terms of income, the United States does quite well in that regard. And actually, that would be true for both average income and median income in the US. So for some reason, the US doesn't do nearly as well in median wealth, but does very, very well in median income. Maybe it means that people have to spend more. Or that they choose to spend more. I don't know. Or maybe it could be that wealth takes into account inflated housing costs in a lot of countries where people are rich because of their house is worth so much. I don't know. But yeah, the US also does well in unemployment rate compared to a lot of Western countries, first world countries. It's not bad in terms of deaths from heat and cold per capita. A lot more people in Europe die of heat and cold compared to US, and a lot of that is in their own homes, frankly. It's because they don't have as much heating or air conditioning. And it's overwhelmingly old people. But yeah, that's an issue more in Europe, to be honest. Heat and cold deaths. Energy costs also higher in Europe, especially now. And certain things that are hard to quantify, like, in my opinion, as someone with food allergies, I actually think US and Canada are way more food allergy friendly than most countries. It's a much more easy to avoid, well, in my case, nuts, compared to a lot of other countries, including many other Western countries, including even like many first world Western countries. Another thing is vulnerability to war. As we see with the recent Ukraine-Russia conflict, Europe, by its geographical location, is a lot closer to the Middle East. It's closer to Russia. Well, Russia is partially in Europe. So like there's more potential for war, I will say. US is very, very OP in that regard in terms of not being vulnerable to direct casualties from global conflicts simply by virtue of distance. Although, to be fair, you could say the same for Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Not to mention Argentina and Uruguay. But yes, I will concede that vulnerability to war is much lower in the US compared to Europe. Like, the possibility of there being a major war that directly hits Europe is much higher than for the US or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay. And that seems especially true for Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is the most vulnerable, as we can see with the current conflict and with other countries that feel vulnerable that it could spill over to there. Like, you know, there's plenty of fears of that in countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So, yeah, I mean, that would be one regard in which the US is better. So, yeah, I mean, all these. But overall, I just think overall, when looking at all these statistics, I think the idea that the US is the best country is just extremely dubious. And especially that it's the best country in every regard. In many of these metrics, as I've shown, the US clusters more closely with like middle income, like second world countries, or even some cases third world, than with first world. And if it does cluster with the first world, it often clusters with like the lower end first world countries. So yeah, like the fact that the US does so poorly on so many of these metrics shows to me that no, it's not the best country in the world in quality of life in every regard. Certainly not. And overall, I would say it's probably not the best in terms of quality of life either. That's more debatable because, again, it depends which metrics you value more than which others. And obviously, some people are more vulnerable to certain things and value certain things more than others. But I'm just saying, overall, the idea that the US is like the undisputed best country in the world in every regard, or best country in the Western world, in the white majority world in every regard, and I would dispute that. I would seriously dispute that. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.